Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 84. Today we're going to be talking about can America get big things done anymore, plus Biden's first 100 days. So I'm thinking as we're getting closer to the ending of his first 100 days, we're pretty much there. It's around that arbitrary distinction. That's just sort of an invisible line in the sand people draw. 100 days, first 100 days. It's a landmark and a hallmark. This idea that's seeped into, is America too big, unwieldy, too slow, too cumbersome, too stupid to make big changes anymore? Is there too many things blocking it? Obviously, the Senate is an enormous problem. The Electoral College is a huge problem. So there's all these things kind of blocking big structural changes that we've been talking about and talking about for decades, but nothing ever really seems to get done. And I thought this was an interesting topic because I'm about to become 35 in a couple months. We're getting around that melancholy age because I started the podcast back in 2016, so exactly 5 years ago when I became 29 to 30. There's one episode where I literally talked about it and talked about how I was going to curl up in the fetal position. So anytime you get those kind of big milestone birthdays, sometimes it can fill you with melancholy as you think, wow, I didn't really accomplish what I thought I would in that 5-year period or that 10-year period or whatever. My 20th birthday was somewhat exciting, but my 30th birthday, I thought, wow, all the plans I had for that decade, they really didn't work out. But different plans worked out in a different way. And even though I'm 35, sometimes feels like I'm 55 or 65. I sometimes feel like my life is more over than it really is. And maybe that's part of the youth culture that we all kind of embrace, where it's like if you haven't done something by the time you're 21, you're not going to do it. And we put such a big emphasis on youth. A couple weeks ago, they had an interview with Simone Biles on 60 Minutes. And they were talking about her like she was a retiree, because this Tokyo Olympics, this is the last Olympics that she'll really get to do. But obviously, most things in life are not like a gymnast where it's like, oh, if you haven't done it by the time you're 20, you're not going to do it. And we think of it that way, but maybe we really shouldn't. It's interesting because we hear people say, oh, you know, that, 90 is the new 60 and 60 is the new 40. We hear them say these things, but yet when it comes to actual aging, we're just as cruel about it as we've ever been, even though I kind of do believe that. People live to be a lot longer now. They live to be 90 years old and 100 years old, sometimes in perfect mental condition. Sometimes they don't have any real mental decline. We see that with Biden, where it's kind of this inspiring story. So I do think people can do things older than they ever have before, even though our society still puts a real premium on if you haven't done it by the time you're 30, you're not going to. As an actor, sometimes people will say, oh, well, now, if you're 35 and you haven't had a major movie role, forget it. And I'm like, well, where does that come from? Because Morgan Freeman, he didn't break out till he was in his 40s. And you can give countless examples of that, where there's a lot of actors where you'd never seen them until they were in their 40s and 50s. They started later. Maybe they weren't Ryan Gosling. Maybe they weren't Chris Evans. Maybe they weren't the lead in the Superman movie, but you still knew who they were. And I think this is one of the reasons that people kind of really like Joe Biden, is it is inspiring for older Americans to see somebody who can become president at 78 years old and do a really pretty good job. And I think that it's not something that we talk about a lot, but he got a lot of older votes. After the election was over, all we heard was that he didn't do particularly hot with Latino Americans, and Trump got a marginally, fractionally bigger percentage of the black vote. But Biden did a lot better with older Americans than Democrats usually do. Democrats usually get killed in like older white Americans, rural Americans, working class Americans, and Biden really, or the working class white Americans, I should say. And Biden really didn't. Those demographics, he did a little bit better than, like, say, Bill Clinton or Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton. As long as I've been alive, Democratic politicians have always gotten killed in certain groups. And Hillary made that easy because they were able to use gender against her, and they've been demonizing her for 30 years. So it was like they were already primed to accept that, oh, she might have killed someone. Joe Rogan's like, I'm not saying she definitely killed Seth Rich, but she might have. And I thought, you're so fucking irresponsible. You know that's not true. And you're going to go out there and tell these young male horde that believe your bowel movements are sacrosanct. You're going to go out there and tell them this bullshit. With Barack Obama, of course, they were able to use race, and not just race, but religion, because his dad was a Muslim, and not just religion, but xenophobia, because his dad was African, and not just that, but the anti-miscegenation thing, where his parents were an interracial couple, and then eventually Obama supported gay marriage, so there was a homophobic element. So it was all these sort of prejudices wrapped up into one. It's quite frankly a miracle that Barack Obama got elected. I think that just shows you how badly that Bush fucked up was that people were willing to turn to somebody that was totally different. But it was really easy that once he did get elected, Republicans were able to demonize him. They were able to say he is the worst thing that's ever happened. But even before then, even before you have gender and race, you could go back to John Kerry, and there was an anti-Catholic bias. Al Gore and Bill Clinton, they're too young. Bill Clinton's too sleazy. He's going to fuck the whole country. I mean, it seems almost quaint to think about it now. But when people say, oh, people, they irrationally hated Barack Obama. Bill Clinton, I can honestly remember being in Alabama in the 90s and people talking about him. I just tell you, I had a substitute teacher say they wouldn't mind assassinating him to a class of impressionable young kids in school, right? I mean, so this shows you that there was a lot of animus towards Bill Clinton when I was in middle school and elementary school. It's sort of incredible to think about it now, but I mean, of course, he did get impeached over a blowjob. People say, well, there's no difference between Bill Clinton and Donald Trump. There's an enormous difference. What Bill Clinton was impeached for was absolutely absurd. As we've covered many times in the podcast, what Trump was impeached for both times was substantially worse. And actually, if you combine every impeachment vote that's ever been, so for Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton, Donald Trump received more impeachment votes than every other president in American history combined. He's not just the first president to be impeached twice in the House, but he's received more votes than all the others put together for impeachment, which is kind of incredible if you think about it. That's his legacy. That's where he'll go down. The first president since Benjamin Harrison to lose back-to-back popular votes, never should have been the president, and then impeached more than any other president in history combined. Wow, what a legacy, right? But with Bill Clinton, there was that hatred about, oh, he's sleazy, he's out there, he's prowling the streets, he's looking for young girls. Even before then, you get to Jimmy Carter, which was to say, well, he's too young, he's naive, he's stupid, he doesn't know what he's doing, which I hate to say it is a slightly accurate statement about Jimmy Carter. But with Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter, they were able to use their youth against him. For JFK, they were able to use his youth against him. He's sleazy, he's fucking everything that moves, blah, blah, blah. I can sort of feel the Republican frustration that they don't have a good line of attack against Joe Biden, that there's no way to really stop him or turn people against him. Joe Biden's only real Achilles heel is his son Hunter Biden and his dog Major Biden. Fucking Cujo over there. Cujo's running around biting everybody. But even Major's not that big a deal. Major bites people and they cover that. That doesn't really make Joe Biden look bad, and it gives the media something to talk about, and then people can write their stupid think pieces. Should dogs be allowed to bite people or whatever? And it gives the media something to churn through their gears and something to talk about and chew about. Of course, people love dogs. It was always weird that Trump never had a dog, that he could never love something that there was no profit in. He barely loved Barron Trump, barely pretended that Barron existed, kept him in the shadows all the time. So to have a dog or a goldfish, even any kind of pet, a reptile, in one way someone like Trump would benefit, because it'd be like, do you love me, goldfish? Of course you do. You love me, if he had a pet fish or something. But a dog, I think that kind of affection is harder for them to fake. They're a little more high maintenance. You got to be around them a little bit more. I tell you what they ought to do. They ought to train Major Biden to bite Mitch McConnell, like to rip his throat out, like a pit bull. Like, all those Dateline specials where the husband trains the pit bull to kill the wife, or the wife does the husband, vice versa, whatever. Well, they should do that for Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell thought it was an ordinary day, but then Major Biden had other plans, and then it just rips his throat out or something. But Hunter Biden's the only real Achilles heel that he has. And so to find out that Hunter Biden has a book and is going around talking about this book, I thought, go the fuck away. For 4 years or 8 years if Biden runs again, but I hope he doesn't. I don't think he will. But for 4 years, go away completely until Kamala Harris gets elected in 2024. Until 2025, don't let us see you. Don't let us hear your name, okay? Disappear. And it's like, oh, the book is going to try to rehab his image. We're going to try to give him more positive. No, Hunter Biden is a fuck up. He's one of the only Democrats that I'm actually kind of worried about, and it's because he's the Roger Clinton or the, Jimmy Carter had a loser brother. There's always one in every family. He's it for Joe Biden, but I still think that if he could just go away or disappear, if they could put him in a bunker and the Secret Service just kind of babysit him, bring him ramen noodles or bring him whatever food he wants. He can eat lobster tails and caviar for all I care, but we need to forget that he exists, because Hunter Biden is a fuck up. He is going to try to use his dad's office for personal gain and for profit. Again, we all know that he will. We all know that it's in his DNA. And I don't think that this makes Biden look bad necessarily. Everybody's got that drug addict brother or that, uncle who's an alcoholic, or that kid that's like, well, they stole money from me and disappeared and went and got a tattoo with it or whatever. And I think that makes him a little bit relatable. But the problem is that that's always been the way the Republicans thought they were going to get Biden, is through him as a father. So it just really behooves Hunter Biden to keep a low profile. I mean, the guy fucked his brother's widow. It was a little opportunistic on his part. You have to think that Biden, in his darkest moments, in 3 a.m. in the morning when nobody's around, and to himself, he would never admit it, but he'd have to think, why couldn't Bo be here instead of Hunter? I mean, he must think that on maybe a subconscious level, an unconscious level, but that's certainly probably what's happening. So for JFK, Jimmy Carter, and Bill Clinton, even though they were white male presidents, they were still able to use their youth sort of in a way. Joe Biden is really the first president since LBJ on the Democratic side that they don't have a good line of attack against. There's no way to really drive people against him. There's no way to scare people against him. The media can't stand it. The media, I feel, would love it if Joe Biden died, because they can't find a way to fearmonger against Joe Biden in any kind of a way. They're trying really hard, but there's no way to do it. And so they're probably sitting there thinking like, thank God for coronavirus. When coronavirus ends, we're not going to have anything to scare the hell out of people with. People are going to go outside and live their lives again. They're not going to be glued to MSNBC learning about this evil thing that happened all day long. But talking about Biden's first 100 days, all I needed was 100 minutes to tell that there was going to be a substantial difference. When Jen Psaki came in and gave that wonderful press conference on the first day, it really did look like there was a new sheriff in town. First of all, going from like Sarah Huckabee Sanders, that bruiser, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who looked like a damn TSA agent or something. She's just like, hey, buddy. I mean, she's so antagonistic. Really looked like she wanted to beat him up. Probably would. I mean, she looks like the kind of woman you'd walk past her in the hall and she'd bump into you on purpose, be like, out of my way, cunt, or something, just shove you down. The reporters in Sarah Huckabee Sanders, they look like you have to return something at a store that you hate. Like, you hate going in this store and you got to return it, and you know that they're going to give you attitude. It's just a terrible customer service experience. You're like, why'd I even buy this from here? But you got to go in there and return it. And that's really what she felt like. There was just an antagonism there that you just don't see with Jen Psaki. And people say, well, the media, they're in the bag for Biden. Trump told people the media was the enemy of the people. I mean, almost right off the bat, they struck an antagonistic note. Sean Spicer struck an antagonistic note. Trump told him to. When you have an administration that hates the media, and Bush hated the media, and Nixon hated the media, when Republicans begin to embrace this idea that the media are scum, and they do this on purpose, of course it's intentional, because Stephen Colbert had the great quote, reality has a well-known liberal bias. They're doing this because if they can make it look like the media is biased for liberals, then the media won't cover them honestly. If you cover both parties honestly, if you try to be objective, then you have Watergate, where Nixon thought it was okay to break into the Democratic headquarters and steal information. You have the Iran-Contra affair. You have Reagan making a deal with Iran just to sabotage Jimmy Carter, just to hurt his re-election chances, which that's treason. Reagan committed treason. Then you have them trying to impeach Bill Clinton over a blowjob. Al Gore being screwed out of the presidency. He's the rightful president in 2000. He gets screwed out of it completely. Then you have birtherism. Barack Obama's elected in a landslide. There's no way they can screw him because it wasn't close in the popular vote or electoral college. So then they do birtherism to make him look illegitimate. Then they block Merrick Garland, our rightful chance to take back the Supreme Court. They block that. Then Hillary Clinton's screwed over because the electoral college, once again, for the second time in only 16 years, goes against the will of the people, whereas it had only happened twice in the 200 years before the year 2000. Then you have Joe Biden wins in a landslide, electoral college and popular vote. This is not close. This election is not close. If you don't get anything else from this podcast, please go against the narrative that like, wow, I'm surprised Trump did as well as he did. He didn't do well for an incumbent president at all. But then Joe Biden wins. There's no question that he wins. Trump decides he doesn't want to go anywhere anyway and tries to foment an insurrection for several months at a time. When Joe Biden comes in, his day one is really day one because there was no transition. They blocked every single thing he was trying to do. They let coronavirus get worse and worse. They let the economy get worse and worse. They didn't care. They wanted him to inherit a whole bunch of disasters, thinking like, well, the worse it is for him, the easier it'll be for me to get reelected in 2024, the Republicans to take back power in 2024. So they didn't try to help him out at all. There was no transition at all. And it was really disgraceful. But the idea that a presidential race can be not close and they still try to steal it, and then they foment a mob, an angry mob, to come in and ransack the Capitol, which hasn't happened since the War of 1812, and even that was an invading army. When you add these things together, the media really would be doing a disservice to cover both parties equally. Democrats have never had anything like Watergate. They've never had anything like Russia and WikiLeaks breaking into the DNC servers to steal information. They've never spread birtherism like, oh, did you know Reagan? He wasn't born in America. No president's ever cut a deal with a hostile foreign government just to deny a Republican president a second term. They've never said, well, we lost, as Trump definitely lost in 2020, and then just tried to steal it anyway. And they've never tried to impeach something over a blowjob. A rightfully elected president, that was really stupid. I can't really get over it because when you have a president in his final 2 years, it doesn't really make sense to try to impeach him. You really think about it, if they'd gotten what they wanted, the Democrats would have been better off, because if Bill Clinton had been impeached and Al Gore had become president, he wouldn't have lost in 2000. He would have been reelected. If Bill Clinton had resigned and said, well, I must resign, and Al Gore had become president, I think it would have been tough to beat Al Gore, because then he's the incumbent president. He's already doing the job. The economy's great. Bill Clinton's out of the way. I really think that it would have benefited Democrats. But that just shows you how Republicans don't give a shit. The politics of, if we can find an opportunity to impeach a Democrat in the last 2 years of their term, when they're ineligible to run again, and it won't hurt them and it might help their vice president, we're going to take that opportunity. We don't care. They're unruly children. And so we're left with this terrible party where when they're out of power, they're dangerous as hell, as they're shown with Joe Biden. They don't want to help him do anything. Not one Republican voted for the stimulus that we just got, and I predict that not one Republican will vote for the infrastructure package. So they don't want to help him do anything when they're out of power, because all they want to do is they want to hurt him so they can get back in power. They did this with Bill Clinton. They did this with Barack Obama. They did this with Jimmy Carter. They do it all the time. They want to hurt the incumbent Democrat so they can take back the White House. But then when they do, they don't do anything. So when they're in power, nothing gets done, and we get held hostage with these people who don't want to do anything. They don't want progress. They want to keep us in the 1950s as though that decade never ended. And I'm talking about on climate change. I'm talking about on corporate welfare, which is actually worse today than it was in the 1950s. The 1950s would be a good landmark to go back to for economic liberalism, but they don't want that. They want this hybrid of economically they want to go back to like the 1890s or the 1920s, and then socially they want to go back to the 1950s. So that's the hybrid that they want. They want a period that really never existed, like an extremely socially conservative period along with an extremely fiscally conservative period, which has kind of never really existed. They want to create that, and that's what they want to create. When they're in power, they don't do anything. Trump talked about infrastructure, talked about it a lot, never did a damn thing about it. He talked about all these things that he wanted to do and never did them. So they get in office, they don't do anything. Then they get out of office, they want to sabotage Democrats to keep anything from getting done. Can we get big things done anymore? Biden is trying. He wants to do infrastructure packages, which Barack Obama and Trump and even Bush have talked about infrastructure, the need for it. America's ports are falling apart. The airports, all you need to do is take an international flight. Take an international flight from Tokyo to JFK. You see the need for the infrastructure. I mean, it's right there. It's obvious. You go internationally to all these different airports. I once took a flight from Singapore, which Singapore has one of the most extravagant and nice airports I've ever seen, to JFK. It was literally like, which country is the third world country? Which place is supposed to be the leader of the free world? Which place is the world's biggest economy? And it was really that noticeable and that bad. Can America get big things done anymore? There's a YouTube channel that I love that shows different huge construction projects around the world, massive projects, like China might build the world's longest bridge for some stupid reason, or Dubai is building a new massive skyscraper, or the biggest soccer stadium in the world is being built in India, things of that nature. And America is almost never in that countdown. You see every once in a while a video in Europe, a lot of them are in Asia, but the United States is almost never in this countdown. Have we just completely given up on building? And so the conversation about infrastructure, it almost feels like we're going to go back and build the infrastructure we should have built 40 years ago instead of the infrastructure we're going to need for the next several decades. Instead of going out and building mass rail, why not a hyperloop, which is going to be the future of it? Instead of going out and building ports and airports the way that they would have been built 20 years ago when we should have built it under Bush, no, we're going to go out and maybe build it the way that they're going to look in 30 years from now. Why not build smart infrastructure and newer infrastructure than what we're already doing? Oh, I know, because Republicans are tied to the industries of yesterday, concrete and coal and gas and steel companies that should have went out of business 20 years ago. They're tied to these things that should have really been done away with a long time ago, and they want that port to go to their dinosauric companies instead of the companies of the future. But when you have these things about climate crisis that desperately need to get done, Republicans are not going to do this. They're just going to simply stand in the way. We recently had Earth Day, and Earth Day gets you to think about there's one day where we all pretend to care about the earth, and then we go right back to treating it like garbage. People consume more shit than they ever need. There's a video I recently shot about how junk food is killing the planet just like it's killing your body, because there's packaging inside of packaging. You buy a box of ice cream sandwiches, you open up the box, each individual one has a plastic wrapper on it. You don't really need that plastic wrapper, but you have it anyway. Okay, so this is one box of junk food for one person to eat, 4 ice cream sandwiches, and you've got a box that won't biodegrade because it's coated in chemicals, and you've got 4 plastic wrappers. That's just one example. But anytime you buy candy, anytime you buy desserts, you buy a tub of Reese's, it's a plastic bag, and then inside each individual one, gold-tinted aluminum foil. And then you open up the Reese's Pieces, and there's like a piece of wax paper that separates the chocolate from the aluminum foil. And so you're talking about 3 different components just to eat a tiny piece of chocolate that you can pop off like M&Ms. So there's a lot of packaging waste that's going to have to be redone and retrofitted. People talk about bad things for the environment. We usually focus on fossil fuels, which is definitely an enormous part of the component. But packaging for food, the way that food is done, is horribly wasteful. Fashion is very wasteful. Fashion is one of the least environmentally sustainable industries on the planet. So between fashion and food, we don't even need to get to fossil fuels before they're killing us. But you got all the F's, the fashion, the fossil fuels, sometimes film, sometimes movie productions are very environmentally unsustainable. There's a lot of industries that need to change. They desperately need to change. How do you convince them to change? And recently I watched a documentary called Planet of the Humans. Now, if you haven't heard of this, I don't want to really encourage you to watch it because it's full of a lot of bogus information. But inside the documentary, it's sort of an anti-environmental documentary in that they really take aim at the environmental movement. Michael Moore helped produce this movie. He didn't direct it, but I kind of looked at it and thought, why did he feel this movie needed to exist? I'm not totally 100% sure. But they make a few good points, like biomass is really not a very good fuel. It may harm the environment more than it helps. So it takes a hearty aim at biomass, and it goes after ethanol, which I think people kind of know that biomass and ethanol are not the most environmentally sustainable fuels you could be using. Maybe they do more harm than good. But then it has all these weird preoccupations, like it keeps going after Bill McKibben and Al Gore, which is ridiculous. Al Gore helped put climate crisis on the map. People weren't even really talking about it, or at least not most people, before he kind of got in there. And then it shits on solar panels and windmills, which is just baffling to me why you would go after those. It talks about that they're not replacing fossil fuels at the rate we think. Well, of course not. They're a transitional fuel source. We're transitioning into them. Once they replace fossil fuels, once you have the power grid hooked up to solar and wind farms, then you're going to be seeing a difference, right? But we've just had 4 years. First of all, during the Obama years, solar panels weren't quite as good as they are now. And then you had 4 years of Trump, where, of course, he's not going to switch over power grids from dirty coal-producing plants over to solar and windmills and stuff like that. He's not going to promote that. Looked at the documentary and thought, I don't really get their point. I feel like they're just trying to be contrarian. It's what the environmental movement kind of used to be, which was sort of like these cranks who were way off to the side. They were sort of obscurantists. They were very much, we don't want to include a lot of people in this. And it became less about like, how are we going to save the planet, into being like, this is the purity test. I'm more pure than the majority of society because I consume less, or I have solar panels. And so I think that the whole movie reeks of that type of like, I'm holier than thou, which a lot of the environmental nuts, I can remember back in the 90s before the environmental movement started to get more mainstream, they really had that feeling to them. Like, I wear hemp flavored vest and I'm better than you and stuff like that. And I think it's trying to reestablish that, which is a very deadly dynamic. There's obviously more people in the world than a couple of hundred guys who meet and talk about the environment, right? You need a broad coalition of people willing to adopt these things. I'm an average consumer. I'm no more environmental than most people. I'm speaking about myself. I need to be willing to make some of the changes they're talking about if you want to have any real dent in what the problem is. If I don't want to make any of the changes you're talking about, we're all going to die. You have to convince people on an individual level and a government policy level, like packaging. There's one part where they're asking a guy, like, what's the most environmentally sustainable packaging? He's like, oh, well, it's not glass, and it's not sand, and it's not wood, and it's not aluminum, and it's, he's shitting on everything that we make stuff out of, but he doesn't make any proposals. The movie doesn't make any real proposals. They don't say like, well, we should use nuclear power. They don't even mention nuclear power. They don't say, well, we need a birth quota. We need to limit people from having more than, let's say, 3 kids. They don't even mention that. They need to say, well, we need to switch to plant-based packaging or something like that. There needs to be a different type of packaging. They don't even mention that. So they're not really big on concrete solutions, and that's why it has that feeling of, we're liberals, we're progressives, we're better than you. We're not going to tell you necessarily how to solve these problems. We're just going to bring up these problems over and over again, make you feel bad about it. And that kind of message for most people are not glued to Twitter. They're not glued to MSNBC. They're not wanting to feel bad. if you tell most people that the world's going to end, there's nothing they can do about it, they're going to run to the Republicans who are telling them a lie, which is you can continue to consume fossil fuels and plastics and everything you've been doing forever your whole life. You can keep doing that. That's our default mode anyway. Our default mode is not to do radical change, not for most people. Our default mode is to sort of keep the status quo. People are afraid of change. We're creatures of habit. We're not going to throw out the baby with the bathwater unless it becomes absolutely necessary that there's something really terrible happening. So when you tell people nothing they do really makes a difference anyway, they're just going to run to the Republicans who are telling them like, hey, all that stuff's a bunch of bullshit. Climate crisis isn't real. It's just something that Al Gore and Bill McKibben made up so they can get rich. And if Michael Moore is producing a documentary that's essentially saying the same thing, that's going to turn people off. And then the movie avoids any real solutions. One idea that I'm kind of increasingly moving towards is the idea that the world is incredibly overpopulated and that there may have to be some type of agreement of a birth quota. But if you even say the word birth quota, people go crazy. Eugenics, right? Like they fucking go nuts. First of all, I think eugenics has been unnecessarily thought of as a terrible thing. CRISPR now exists to where we can begin to edit the gene codes and you can begin to pull out some of the worst things in your genetics. I don't see this as a bad thing at all. In the future, we're going to have increasingly two camps, which is one camp that is overly hamstrung by morality. And they're not just necessarily religious people. It used to be just religious people. Religion is kind of playing less of a role in our lives. And so now you have the far left, people that are like, well, who are you to say that being deaf is a handicap? Being deaf is a handicap. I'll go ahead and give you that incredibly controversial statement that being deaf is a handicap. If you could go into the genetic code of someone who's deaf, if you could make it to where they could hear again, if you could give them a robotic implant in their ear, if you could take sickle cell anemia out of someone's genetic code, there's not a parent alive who wouldn't do that. They're always interviewing these people, these two white people, and I swear it's the same fucking two white people, but they're like, oh, my son has Down syndrome, but I couldn't imagine him any other way. How could a scientist come in here and say that, well, they can edit it and get rid of it? They shouldn't be allowed to do that. I guess we found the 1% of parents who don't seem to think that Down syndrome is something to be avoided, or sickle cell anemia is something to be avoided, or autism something to be avoided. But for the vast majority of people who will have the choice to edit that out of their genetic code, they will do so. And so I think that there's this incredible pressure to hold back the scientific community. They don't want stem cell research. They don't want CRISPR to edit genes. What are you resisting? Cloning? We could clone organs. It's ridiculous to me that people still die of organ failure. Like, oh, I waited on the kidney transplant list, but I never could get one. Why not have cloned organs? Why not have unlimited stem cell research to get in there and figure out how can we cure cancer? How can we do organ transplants? Is there a way to do this stuff? And so to have people hamstrung by the morality of it, and in America, it's like we're consumed with the morality of something that barely even exists yet. You'll see on the news, well, people want to do cloned organs, and before they even get to the science part, they go, now let's talk to a physical ethicist and let them tell us if we should even be able to do this or not. And I'm like, why do we give a shit what they think? It's sort of the way that education has been prioritized to where liberal education, and by that I mean liberal arts education, has been prioritized over just about anything else. Before we get to the hard science, before we get to a scientist who says, can we even do these things? First, we'll go to the head of the liberal arts department at Brown University, and then they'll give us a speech about the ethics of something before we've even been able to try to prioritize it. People talk a lot about how expensive college education has become. For hard science majors, for STEM majors, it should be more affordable. And I'm sure there's ways to make it more affordable. There's a lot of scholarships. There's a lot of grants for people going into things that we actually need. I don't know that we need to make it more affordable for liberal arts majors, which there's probably already too much of. And I'm saying that as a liberal arts major. I went into liberal arts. I did it without going into a shitload of debt. But if I had been able to go into $300,000 worth of debt to get my mass media communications degree and then turn around and say, but the government needs to go back and refund me for this money that I spent, I can kind of understand why taxpayers would think that would be a waste of their money to be able to do that, to go give me a reimbursement for a degree that I really don't use, that nobody can really use if we're being honest about it, that's sort of a dead major. And a lot of liberal arts majors are like that. They get these majors. What can you do with it? You can teach that major to other people. It's a little bit like a Ponzi scheme, and that the only thing you can really do with poetry majors and things like that is you can get hired onto the faculty of the college, perhaps, that you just graduated from, so you can reel in other suckers to major in that same liberal arts major. So then you can hook them and say, here's what I learned is, when in fact you're teaching that at that college because you couldn't get hired anywhere else. There was no job for you. So you became a college professor teaching the same thing. And that's what I could probably do with a mass media communications degree, probably the best thing I could do with it. And then I get 20 new students a year who come into my circle, and I teach them what I know, which is not much because there's not a lot of jobs out there that focus on that. And then they take that out into the world and maybe they become professors, and then they hook 20 more people like that. Can America get big things done anymore? We're talking about student loan debt, which is astronomical, threatens to topple the entire economy. And we do need to make college more affordable. The idea that college is now completely unaffordable, that's a relatively recent thing. My mom paid pennies on the dollar for her college education. What she paid back about 30 years before I went to college, it was only about 30 years between when she went to college and when I went to college. But the difference was enormous in terms of the cost. And then from when I went to college, which I've only been out of college about 15 years or so, and then what my kids will experience when they go to college in about 15 years, that will be astronomical. That difference in the debt. So can we let college just become so unaffordable? People are just sunk with this debt. There's got to be something done about that. A lot of politicians go into the idea like, we'll make college free. The government will reimburse colleges for this. We'll make health care free. Medicare for all. We'll reimburse the medical establishment for this. I think you might have to go a bit further into a more difficult conversation, which is to say, we're going to cap college tuition. We're not going to let them charge whatever the hell they want to. And that idea drives people nuts. We're going to cap medical expenses. I'm sorry, doctors. You just have to make do with $500,000 a year. Can't get to the $1 million a year, but we have to cap it at a certain point. We can't have you charging $6,000 for an x-ray or $60 for a bandage that cost you 10 cents or something like that. Pharmaceutical drugs and all that stuff, we may cap the prices. But when you start talking about that, that's when people start to get very weird. They don't like the idea of price caps, even though that is the obvious solution. The same thing when you kind of talk about the environment. Population quotas. Capping the number of kids that people can have. That may become a necessary component, at least for a few generations. But that makes people incredibly antagonistic. They don't like that idea at all. They will resist that with their last breath. And so you kind of get to this thing where we're talking about all these problems. Liberalism is all about the problems that we're facing. But then you start to get to the real solutions. And they seem kind of resistant to get into that. Birth quotas is something that they don't like. They don't like even discussing that possibility. Eugenics and CRISPR for bad genes, editing out some of the bad genes, which is where a lot of the healthcare costs go. They go to people with serious and chronic medical conditions. You could begin to eliminate those with CRISPR. And that kind of scares them to an extent. Then you get to healthcare and you talk about, well, we may have to start capping doctors' salaries. Well, no, I don't like that idea either. Then college tuition. Well, Harvard, they may have to cap what they can charge. Auburn University, where I went, may have to cap what they can charge. Well, no, I don't like that idea either. And we're looking at solutions that are kind of not really solutions. And then the necessary solutions is on the other side of what we're currently talking about. And I feel like there's a real resistance to doing that. Can a president make that big of a difference when we're talking about this stuff? Absolutely. You can already see a difference. In 100 days, we've gone from a country that people were saying, is America going to be around in a year? Trump's final year in office, we had race riots, obviously coronavirus rampaging around the world. The economy was flatlining. We had a president who was hiding in a bunker as he fanned the flames on Twitter. Back in May of last year, they were tearing down the gates of the White House. 6 months later, there was insurrection. It really became popular in 2020 for people to ask, is there going to be a civil war? Are we headed for a civil war? In 100 days, we've gone from wondering if there was going to be a civil war, if America was going to break up, if there was going to be that kind of massive division, to being like, can Biden get his infrastructure package passed? That's how much the conversation can change just based on who the president is. To go from looking at America as an insolvent mess that might break up and might split apart and be forever doomed just because Trump is president, to now Biden's president and being like, exactly what the number of infrastructure dollars is Biden going to be able to pass? I think that's a miracle. Nothing short of a miracle that in only 3 or 4 months, we've gone from having one conversation that was very dark, extremely dark, to being like, coronavirus is not over, but is ending. People who want a vaccine can go get one now, just about. It's just about widely available. We're beginning to open the country back up. Perhaps too late, in my opinion. Some industries are really being hammered. In Los Angeles, the Pacific Theaters, there was a chain of movie theaters called the Pacific Theaters. They've said they're not going to reopen at all because they're pretty much all Los Angeles based. And for a year, all the movie theaters in Los Angeles were basically shut down. So how could they stay open and how could they stay in business? Really kind of nervous about that because now a lot of companies are beginning to reopen the cruise lines. I think they got to reopen the cruise lines. And I know people that are on Twitter, oh, no, you're crazy, you're nuts. But I do a lot more stuff than people on Twitter do. A lot of people on there, they're scared to death. They go outside, they're scared a bee's going to sting them or something like that. I take a lot more risk than they do because, I'm living in the world and I can't just stay locked up in my house being on Twitter talking about how Trump sucks all the time. I want to live a life. I want to go out there and live a little bit more of a life than that. And so I think cruise lines, it's not realistic to think you can keep them shut down for a year and a half and then all of them are going to be able to reopen. If they're not being able to generate new money and bring in new revenue, it's hard for any business to stay open for as long as they have. Movie theaters, I'm not surprised that Pacific Theaters in Los Angeles closed. I'm not surprised Glow Zone and a few of the kids' play places I used to love carrying my son to, I'm not surprised that they have closed. So I think that was always the real danger of these shutdowns, is that you'd get the worst of both worlds, which is exactly what we got. We got a lot of people dead, and we got a lot of businesses that went out of business. And it almost looks like America tried to split the difference. We'll keep everything shut down, and yet at the same time, there'll be no coordinated federal response. We won't prepare for this at all. We won't call in FEMA. We'll have the federal government bid against states for medical supplies. We won't have any consistent messaging on what people should do. We won't have the governors get on the same page as us. Everybody will be doing it for themselves. It's 50 states, every man for himself, every state for himself. And that was the worst of both worlds. We had a lot of people die, and we had a year where we couldn't fucking do anything but stay at home and watch the news and watch the George Floyd riots. Oh, my city's burning. Oh, look at that business that's getting ransacked right now. It hadn't been open in a few months because of coronavirus. Isn't that interesting? I mean, we really did the worst of both. Trump let a virus rampage through America for several months, didn't bother to track and trace, didn't bother to begin the process of preparing that this could be as bad as it was, let states bid against each other for medical supplies, then came up there and ran up the price, talked about injecting bleach, pumped up that hydroxychloroquine, which I can barely remember the name of it at this point. I mean, he was all over the place. He said something different every single day, and we never had a coordinated federal response. Compare this to the Obama years. Obama had SARS, Obama had MERS, Obama had swine flu, Obama had the Ebola virus. And I understand that maybe none of those put together are necessarily as contagious as COVID, but all four of those pandemics, we didn't close the country down. We didn't have massive loss of business. We didn't shut down the economy. It really does matter who is in charge. Republicans talk about small government. Well, we had small government for a year during the pandemic, and what happened was the biggest cities in America, the biggest drivers of GDP, they had to shut down completely. Los Angeles had to go in near constant lockdown for over a year. We're still kind of in it. We're just barely beginning to lift all the restrictions. Several senators, like in Connecticut, Richard Blumenthal apparently wrote a letter to the CDC saying, oh, you shouldn't allow cruise lines to reopen, which I'm looking at it like, what is the plan just to keep certain industries punished and clobbered and punish them forever? Let them never reopen? Is that the plan that we're hearing about? Because I'm just curious as to how you can have a vaccine that any American can now get. They've lifted all restrictions across the nation for people over 16 to get the vaccine. And right now, cruise lines are being forbidden from opening for April, May, and June. I think they're not allowed to go back till July. So I'm assuming his letter is saying, oh, well, don't do July or August either. It becomes the same cycle where it's like the best time to do this is in the summertime. There's a lot of heat, a lot of sun. It's been proven that COVID has a harder time there than it does in the wintertime. And so you skip the summer months for a second year in a row, and then you go right into the colder months like October and November where cases are going to go up no matter what happens. And then be like, oh, cases are going up. We can't let the cruise lines reopen, so we got to sit. And then you've benched them effectively for 2 full years. Honestly, how could anything stay open in those kind of conditions? You might have one cruise line like Carnival might be big enough to keep its doors open, but there'll be smaller ones that have no choice but to shut down. So I look at this as sort of being, again, random. You can go to a movie theater, but you can't go to a cruise line. You can go on an airplane, but you can't go on a cruise line. You can go on an Amtrak train and a subway, but you can't go on a cruise line. It's completely random. Whereas in the cruising environment, they're cleaning every surface. They're spraying your hands. Even before COVID, anytime you go on a cruise boat, they'd encourage you to wash your hands everywhere. They'd have the hand sanitizer, the bottles, they'd spray them. They really took your health, I believe, more seriously, a lot more seriously than airlines did and airplanes did. Airlines were always a bigger risk to me than cruises were. With an airplane, you're in a completely enclosed environment from people from all over the world quickly coming and going and traveling and doing things like this, getting off at different stops, I just feel like that would be a much more likely environment for disease to spread. That has not really been closed the entirety of COVID. The response never truly made any sense. And now we've gotten it to where Biden has already said he wanted to declare independence from COVID for 4th of July. He wants 4th of July to be like, everybody's vaccinated. There will still be probably some deaths. But if we can get it to less than a few hundred a day, I've got to turn the page at some point. You can't let it go on forever. I feel too many liberals seem comfortable letting it go on forever. When should we stop wearing a face mask? You should never stop wearing one. Let's wear one for the rest of our lives now. When should we let cruise lines reopen? Never. They should never reopen. When should we let movie theaters reopen? I can't believe that they're open now. I wouldn't allow that. I'm never going to a movie theater again. The Republicans didn't take it seriously at all. During the worst months, they basically didn't encourage any social distancing, any face masks. But then you take it to the other point of, can you just be a germaphobe? Can you sort of like separate yourself from a huge chunk of the life you enjoyed in early 2020, right? Like in 2020, January, you would have gone on a cruise. You would have gone to the movies. You would have got on an airplane. You would have done all this stuff. So at what point do you get your life back? And so if you're not willing to transition into that, then you have the secondary thing, which is of fat people. But I know that Bill Maher takes some heat talking about this, but I think he's right. 80% of the hospitalizations and deaths from COVID have been people that were overweight. Obviously, that's worse in America because we're the fattest country on earth. This is not even really being mentioned. They talk about, well, America, we have the worst coronavirus deaths. How can you even talk about letting people go back on cruise boats? We have the worst coronavirus deaths because we're the fattest country on earth. There is a 100% overlap between the fact that 75% of America is either obese or overweight, and we've had the most coronavirus deaths. Directly connected. We don't even want to bring it up. Not to mention the fact there's a lot of Americans, independent of their weight, who are chronically sick. We seem to think it is okay to ask people to live in chronic pain, chronic illness, chronic sickness. Euthanasia is not legal in a single state in the United States. Physician-assisted suicide is only legal in a dozen or so blue states. You can probably guess which ones. It's all the usual suspects, Washington and Oregon and so on. But even then, for physician-assisted suicide, you have to be terminally ill. You have to be medically proven that you will probably die within 6 months. They've given you less than 6 months to live. And even that is when they begin it. What if somebody is just in chronic pain and misery? What if they're like completely immobile, quadriplegic, they can only blink their eyelids, they're depressed, they're miserable, they're anxious? Those people are not eligible for physician-assisted suicide. And you almost think, but who are you to keep them alive if they don't want to be? Who are we to keep people that are chronically ill and in chronic pain, have no standard for what a normal life should be? We are forced to keep these people alive because of some nebulous form of ethics and because of a downright, I would say, paranoia about the term eugenics and what that means and what that is. It's become to where, well, this person's got Down syndrome and they're in a wheelchair and they got spina bifida and they can barely walk. Really, their entire life consists of them slobbering into a plate and then spoon feeding them Jell-O. Let's keep them alive forever. Let's keep them alive till they're 100 years old. The one thing they were able to write is kill me in the sand with their own finger. But that really meant that they love each other and they love Jesus, and we got to keep them alive. Problems are raised with the solution being not that America should lose 50 pounds each. I'm speaking as an overweight American, and I'm trying to lose weight. And I'm saying exactly how hard it is to lose weight. When every time you turn on the television, there's a new ad for Reese's Pieces and there's a new ad for M&M. I was watching a TV show. This was a kid's show, or a family show with my kids. In one commercial break, there was an ad for Pepsi, Reese's, Domino's, Chick-fil-A, and potato chips. And I thought, how in the fuck can anybody lose weight when during a family show there's 5 ads for food in one commercial break? So in one 3 or 4 minute segment, there was 5 ads for food, just one commercial break. You know, my son's watching that, been like, that looks good, that looks good. No wonder America has such a problem with being fat. But instead of telling people like, okay, maybe we should put limits on what food companies can advertise, especially to young children, maybe we should put limits on the amount of food commercials that we can watch during TV. Hell no. We don't even want to talk about that. Like, people are not even willing to have that conversation. Real limits have to be instituted at some point. Can big things be done anymore? A big thing that people are talking about is, are we going to go back to the moon? I think we absolutely should have gone back to the moon. We should have already done this. It's amazing to me that all the moon landings took place decades before I was born. Not one time in my lifetime has an American been on the moon. Decades before I was born was the last time somebody even stepped foot on the moon. So in 50 years, we've had this technological advantage that we can put people on the moon. They can walk across the surface of the moon. This is astounding. This is amazing. We could have set up a base. We should already have a colony on the moon. We've had a 50-year advantage of getting to the moon, and the United States just abandoned that for some reason. We didn't seem to think it was important to say, hey, you know what? We'll set up a colony on the moon. There'll be a few hundred scientists and explorers on there at all times. It'll be like McMurdo on Antarctica. We'll have bases like we do on Antarctica for scientists and researchers and astronauts and things like that. And then we'll expand it. We'll see what happens. The moon's a good place to launch people for further space exploration. The Earth's gravity is so strong that it's hard to break Earth's gravity. Apparently on Earth, there's only a very limited window every 2 years that we could even send somebody to Mars. It has to be a specific week every 2 years to even get somebody to Mars. From the moon, you can launch them at any time because the gravity's not as strong and the dynamics different. So to have the moon set up as a permanent space launching pad for all of our space vehicles or our astronauts for deeper space exploration to Mars, to Jupiter, perhaps to the far reaches of our solar system, perhaps to Neptune or something like that. This is something that we should have been building and developing for 50 years, but it's like the second we got somebody to walk across the surface of the moon, well, been there, done that, guess we'll move on to something else, and then just abandon that. I'm curious to know if Biden can get big things done. I hope that he can. If anybody can do it, I think he can do it because the media is not able to monger fear against him in the same way. And they don't like that about him. I wish the media would change their dynamic from one of scaring the shit out of you, being like, how dare you leave the house without a mask on during coronavirus? How dare you even think about going to the movie theater during coronavirus? How dare you even think about going on a cruise during coronavirus? How dare you even suggest to people that they should lose weight as an effective form of fighting against coronavirus? How dare you even suggest that there should be price caps on a doctor's salary or a college tuition? How dare you even suggest these things? So instead of going from a fear-based model, they can go to a hope-based model of it being like, we want to see Biden be able to accomplish these things. Just as many people would watch a broadcast of America going back to the moon as they would us sitting here tearing him down. So why not transition that into a more hope-based thing? That'll never happen. But I mean, they should consider that. A record number of Americans at the time watched Neil Armstrong walk across the moon. How exciting would it be to watch the first woman ever walk across the surface of the moon? And how many people would watch that? And how many people would talk about that? And give them something new to talk about instead of just COVID and Trump and insurrection and racism and the Minneapolis verdict against this Derek Chauvin guy. I'm amazed that that went to trial. I'm really surprised and think if his lawyer didn't encourage him to take a plea bargain, he did him an enormous disservice. Because you look at that case and you think, you are guilty. There's many eyewitnesses. There's a video, eyewitnesses coming up, a nurse being like, I told him he was killing him. He was choking him to death. I said it and they told me to stand back. You have an eyewitness. You have video. You can see the smile on his face as he's murdering this man. You can tell he's clearly enjoying doing this. His commanding officer didn't back him up. Not one person who trained him backed him up. The police department didn't take his side. I'm astounded that his lawyer didn't go to the prosecutor and say, we'll do 25 years or whatever deal they could reach. Let's work out a deal so we don't have to do a trial. We don't have to put people through this. But I feel Chauvin was so arrogant. He thought, well, the Rodney King officers, they got off with it all these decades ago. First of all, the country's changed. But second of all, Rodney King didn't die. That was excessive force. Not saying that's good. That was definitely excessive force. But beating someone within an inch of their life and then they live is a little different than a video showing you smiling as you're strangling the life out of somebody for 11 straight minutes and then they die. I don't know why they even put the city of Minneapolis through a trial and the country through a trial, because I think he thought, well, there's a 1% chance I could be found innocent. The entirety of the United States will burn. We'll have race riots. In Los Angeles, they boarded up all of downtown. They put boards over the windows to guard downtown. But I think he was that selfish that he thought if there's a 2% chance that a trial could involve me being found innocent. And then his lawyer's fighting like a tiger for him. His lawyer's like, oh, Maxine Waters, she wrote a letter and we need a mistrial. And I'm like, dude, nobody wants a fucking mistrial. Nobody wants to do this twice. I mean, first of all, what is your jury selection going to be like for a second trial? How is it going to be better? Have you been in a coma for 2 years? Do you know who Derek Chauvin is? Have you ever heard of George Floyd? No, you've been in a cave for 2 fucking years? Okay, you're perfect for our jury. Like, how can you even find people that haven't heard of this case? Do you bust them in from American Samoa? I mean, who the fuck hadn't heard of this case inside the United States? I mean, who hadn't seen on the news the riots and stuff? But the fact that he was that arrogant that he thought he could roll the dice and get away with it somehow, and yet was found guilty, we should point to that and say, oh, that's progress. We have a cop who killed somebody. We had eyewitnesses. We had him on tape. We saw the smile. We had his own commanding officers throw him under the bus, basically say he didn't go along with our training. We're still kind of surprised that they find him guilty, and we said, that's progress. And I'm like, wow. So America's idea of getting something big done is to have a murderer held accountable. An obvious murderer is going to go to jail. That's something big that we're thinking about. We have to move beyond that. We can't just have endless conversations about race and religion and sexism and all the kind of identity politics things that, quite frankly, are in a vacuum from the 1960s. They're being held over from the culture wars of the 60s and 70s that never really ended. And so we're sort of continuing that into the new generations. My son, who is young, he's Generation Alpha, he really shouldn't be hearing about racism every single day on television. And I'm not saying that in the Megyn Kelly sense. Megyn Kelly's saying that because she doesn't want her blonde white brats to have to be familiar with those people who are different than her. I'm not saying it in that sense. I'm saying it in the sense of, if you absorb every single day people don't like you and you can't get ahead and the deck is stacked against you, I think that almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy at a certain point. I love letting him watch movies with more positive portrayals of black people that are kind of doing amazing things around the system of racism. But there's not as many of those kind of movies. Movies like The Pursuit of Happiness or Hidden Figures. I love movies like that. But so many of the portrayals that people would see of black people be like 12 Years a Slave or something like that. And I'm not saying that there's not a time and place for both. You can watch both. But if the message you're getting is black people can't get ahead, white people hate them, majority white, by the way, so if white people hate you, then you can sort of begin to see enemies everywhere. And I think that that is a mentality. It made sense in the 60s and 50s. It might have made sense in the 90s, but it's continuing on into the new generations. New generations are becoming infected by old ideas. Even something like walking on the moon. I guess you could say that's in a time machine as well, considering that we literally did it over 50 years ago and haven't done it since. But can America get big things done anymore? We've talked about changing our healthcare system for decades, and it's just kind of gone in a rut since the 90s. The Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, they've been wanting to change our healthcare system, and Republicans use the same talking points today that they used back then. Back then, they're like, well, do you really want the healthcare to function like the post office? Yes. I would love it to function like the post office. The post office where I put a 10-cent stamp and mail something to my mother 3 time zones away. There's not a health insurance company, pharmaceutical company, or hospital chain in the United States that has as positive a public perception as the fucking post office does. The post office is more positively perceived than anything involved in the current healthcare industrial complex. Same thing for libraries, same thing for fire stations. There's a lot of aspects of the government that function much better than the bureaucracies, which I've talked about previously. Of just a few episodes ago, talked about just trying to get a new washer, and it required 3 different independent companies and their contractors, and it was several weeks of work. Wouldn't I love for the government to just come in and say, it's the National Dishwasher Installing Service, going to cost you $10. We're going to come in here, we're going to install it. It's going to be 1 phone call and $10. How's that sound? Of course I would love that. I think that those talking points are so dated, and they've been kind of running them over and over for decades. We're hearing the same talking points, going back to the environmental movement. Solar panels, they can't replace fossil fuels. They are replacing them. Windmills, they're not as efficient as fossil fuels. They're more efficient. Windmills and solar employ more people than coal and gas do. But we're stuck in the same talking points that have been disproven for decades. So when we say, can America do big things? Can we defeat a pandemic? We let COVID kill more people than SARS, MERS, swine flu, and Ebola virus combined. We let it rampage across the country. So it almost looks like for every step forward we take, there's a step backwards. We cured COVID. Hooray. Why did it kill over 500,000 Americans to begin with? Derek Chauvin was found guilty. Hooray. Why was he not kicked off the force before he even got to that point, considering he had a personal connection to George Floyd? He'd already had some disciplinary action taken against him before that. Oh, Biden was able to pass a 3rd stimulus. Hooray! He had to do it through a tiebreaker vote in the Senate because not one single Republican voted for that, even though they voted for an identical stimulus to that the year before. But they didn't want to do it for a Democratic president. If we can get infrastructure passed, that'll be a miracle. If we can get something done about college tuition and making that affordable, if we can refund the public education system, which has had its funding decimated over the years, if we can get Americans to absorb the idea that maybe they should lose a little bit of weight And maybe it's okay to let the genetic code go in. And by the way, I just say one last little thing about CRISPR here. This idea that like, oh, it's messing with God, it's playing with nature. I don't think people understand the idea of forever chemicals. Forever chemicals, and there's a great movie called Dark Waters with Mark Ruffalo and Anne Hathaway. You should check it out. I believe it's on Showtime at this moment, but you can watch it, anywhere you want. You can rent it from the library for free if you have a library near you. It's a great movie. It talks about DuPont producing all these chemicals specifically into their workers, but really into all of us who use their products, like Teflon. And it talks about chemicals that they're so bad, they get into our DNA and they stay in our DNA. So we're absorbing 200, 300 forever chemicals every time that we sit on furniture that's coated in a certain chemical, or we use a Teflon pot, or we eat certain foods. Our DNA is changing regardless of whether we do CRISPR or not, changing in a negative way because of all the added chemicals that are now in our food, in our furniture, in our oxygen, in our air. We're breathing it in. We're sleeping in it. It's in our clothes. It's in polyester. It's coated chemicals in our wrapping paper, in our wax paper for our food, in our aluminum foil that we coat our food in, and our clothes that we wear. So you're going to absorb those chemicals, and it's going to change your DNA whether you do a damn thing or not. Why not let CRISPR take away all the artificial chemicals that are warping your DNA and degrading that and wearing that down? Food for thought. Okay, everybody, enjoy Biden's first 100 days and his next 1,000 days. Stay tuned for episode 85.